New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to examine the Marian Apparitions that took place in Zeitoun, Egypt, a suburb of Cairo, between 1968 and 1971. My guest is Travis Dumsday, who is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Concordia University. He is author of several books, including Dispositionalism and the Metaphysics of Science, Alternative Conceptions of the Spiritual, Polytheism, Animism, and more in Contemporary Philosophy of Religion, and most recently, The Marian Apparitions at Zeitoun, an Evidential Inquiry. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Travis. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks, Dr. Mishlove. It's an honor to meet you, and I have a chance to chat with you today.
I'm looking forward to our conversation because I've been aware of these apparitions at Zeitoun going back, I think, probably to right around the time they happened. They were in the news, and it's always been a mystery. So I'm delighted to have discovered your book and your effort to really look at it, I would say, almost from the perspective of a parapsychologist such as myself, to try and get at what really took place. But to begin with, what triggered your interest?
I'm a philosopher, and one of the areas that I work in is philosophy of religion. And within that field, I've done a fair bit of work on philosophical debates surrounding religious experience, including sort of debates surrounding, are things like religious visions, for example, purely naturalistic events that can be explained entirely by reference to neuroscience, or might there be a supernaturalistic explanation have to be invoked for some such events? And one of the issues I addressed with in some of my early work on that topic is the issue of, there's this distinction between what we might call private religious experiences, where you've just one person at a single time having what appears to them to be some sort of supernatural encounter. So, a single person, whatever, hears a voice or sees a vision during prayer in some kind of religious context. But you've also got group, or what might be called intersubjective religious experiences, where you've got situations where it seems as if multiple people are experiencing the same thing at the same time. And philosophers, I think, should be interested especially in those events, because they do seem to make it more difficult to account for these in purely naturalistic terms, or at least they raise some interesting additional complications for attempts at scientifically explaining religious experience. And so I mentioned this in some early work, and so I was always on the lookout for interesting case studies of intersubjective religious experiences. And I came across the Zeitoun events probably early 2000s. They do get mentioned in some parapsychology literature. D. Scott Rogo has some material about it in one of his books. Some other parapsychologists mentioned it briefly. And so I wanted, because the Zeitoun events were notable due to the sheer numbers of people involved, I've always had kind of like yourself, kind of a back of the mind interest in the events. And then finally, when I had some research time available several years ago, I thought, let me dig into the actual sources and try to get a better sense of what happened there. And as I did, I grew actually increasingly impressed with the nature of these events and some of the careful documentation that had been collected regarding them. And I was able to put together enough material that I thought I could make a decent sort of scholarly argument regarding, what's the current state regarding proposed scientific explanations for these events. And so in the book, I provide, of course, an introduction to the history of these events, and I have a long chapter that provides some examples of eyewitness testimonies for what people were actually experiencing. But much of the book is also just surveying all of the naturalistic explanations that have been proposed so far, specifically for the Zeitoun events, and trying to make the argument that so far none of those explanations are entirely satisfactory.
Many of our viewers will have seen some of the photographs. You, in fact, put one on the cover of your book, or at least a semblance of what might have been a photograph. But probably most people have just the vaguest idea of what occurred over 50 years ago in Egypt. So maybe we could talk about the phenomenon. As I recall, it began on a very particular date and time, around 8 in the evening on April 2nd of 1968.
Yeah, that's right. So, so that initial apparition event, at St. Mary's Church in Zeitoun, Egypt. Zeitoun, by the way, is a suburb of Cairo. So this was a church named after St. Mary, and across the street from the church there was a public transit station where there was some evening workers, still on site, doing their appointed tasks. And one of these public transit workers noticed a female figure on the roof of the church. And initially, he was kind of alarmed because obviously this was an unusual sort of event. He was kind of worried this might be like a nun who was getting ready to throw herself off the roof and kill herself. So he called for help. People called the authorities, and pretty quickly a small sort of crowd assembled around the church. But as they got closer and had a chance to look more carefully, what they realized was that this female figure was radiating light, and she wasn't just on top of the church, she seemed to be floating on top of the church. And when people realized this, of course, the crowd assembled even more rapidly. More people assembled around the church. Eventually, some emergency authorities did arrive to sort of check things out. Some officials within the church were notified what was happening, and I came out to see what was going on. And then eventually, this glowing, floating female figure just disappeared, faded away. So news quickly got around the neighborhood, and then several nights later, this figure reappeared. And so once again, loud crowd assembled. Lots of people saw this entity floating on top of the church. And then this became basically a recurring series of events, which, as news spread throughout Cairo, you started to get thousands of people camping out in front of the church each night. And then as news grew even further, you started to get sometimes tens of thousands of people assembled at the church. And it's worth noting that these events were intermittent and seemingly pretty unpredictable. So this was not the case that this figure appeared every night. It was irregular. It might appear for 10 minutes one night, and then 3 days later it would appear and be there for a couple of hours, and then not appear again for another week, right? So it was irregular. And so you started to have just massive crowds assembled in front of this church, and pretty soon the local government had to take some notice of this, if only for practical purposes of crowd control, right? Because there was a civil order kind of issue that arose. And it got to the point where there was such public demand to assemble at this church, and the crowds got so huge that the government had to just tear down this public transit station that was there across the church just to give more room for people to assemble. And there was a number of phenomena that were taking place. So, of course, the most notable, most recognizable, distinctive feature of these events was this glowing, female-shaped, seemingly three-dimensional, seemingly animate figure that would be floating on top of the church. Sometimes she would just stand there silently. Sometimes she would move around, bow to the crowd, bow to the cross. She seemed to be, again, animate, behaving like a lifelike figure. In other words, this was not eyewitness accounts are very clear, make it very clear that this was not some kind of stationary projection. This was an animate, three-dimensional figure that they perceived as being, lifelike. In addition to the female figure, there was also other kinds of anomalous lights that would appear more or less quickly. There were what people described as glowing doves, what appeared to be birds that would appear and fly around the church, sometimes in the formation of a cross. People sometimes described a massive cloud smelling of incense that would spontaneously form around the roof of the church and then dissipate. So there's a number of phenomena that were taking place, and again, sometimes all of these phenomena would occur on a single night, other times only one, other times you get these mixes, so there was quite a lot of variability in terms of what people were actually seeing. But there's no doubt that on many of these evenings, there were massive numbers of people who agreed they were seeing something they felt to be supernatural. So these events are notable both for the numbers involved. So these events continued for the duration of about 3 years on and off. They occurred most frequently during the first year and a half of the events, and they gradually became less frequent and then petered out in 1971. And different researchers have tried to give different estimates of, how many people likely saw one or another of these events at the church. And the number I settle on after reviewing various estimates is we're probably dealing with at least 1 million Egyptians who saw these events, most of whom were actually Muslim. Egypt is, of course, at the time was around a 90% Muslim majority country. So it was a mixture, the crowds are mixtures of Muslims and Christians who assembled to see this. So these events are notable in terms of the sheer number of witnesses involved. They were notable within the more narrow sort of history of Marian apparitions. These events are also kind of unique insofar as this female figure, which the crowd identified as the Virgin Mary, this female figure never spoke, never gave any kind of a communication or message, which in the larger sort of church history of Marian apparitions, this is a bit unusual. Oftentimes Marian apparitions are associated with some kind of a communication. That was not the case here. And of course, they're also notable insofar as these events were taking place in an Orthodox context. Right? The Egyptian Christian community is almost entirely Coptic Orthodox, whereas I think the broader popular culture tends to associate Marian apparitions more with the Roman Catholic Church, and indeed the Marian apparitions in general tend to play a more important devotional role in the Catholic world than the Orthodox world. So for all of these reasons, these events were historically notable, historically significant, and definitely worthy of scholarly attention.
Well, the idea that the apparition was the Virgin Mary seems to have been fairly well accepted by the population, maybe because of the name of the church. But I gather from the eyewitness reports, it wasn't as if the apparition always appeared to be a very distinctive female figure.
Well, that's right. That's right. Again, exactly what people were seeing could vary from night to night. And so there were some evenings in which people reported simply an amorphous light that might have appeared for a fairly brief period. And then in other evenings, people reported this extremely vivid, detailed figure that was clearly female-shaped, atop the church. And there's also some eyewitness reports. And some of the variability in terms of level of detail here is likely the result simply of prosaic factors, right? Some of the eyewitness reports we have from people who managed to get closer to the church. Others were seeing this stuff from a greater distance or dealing with. On some nights, the Egyptian newspapers recorded that on some evenings there were 250,000 people assembled around the church when these events were happening. And so, of course, you get some of the variability in terms of level of detail, I think is simply a result of how close could they get, what was their vantage point, etc. But there also does seem to be, that aside, it does also seem to be the case that on some evenings the figure did appear in greater levels of detail. So, for example, in some of the eyewitness reports, you get people noting that they thought they could discern facial features, for example. Whereas other eyewitnesses were saying, no, there was definitely this female-shaped figure of light, but they couldn't see anything more closely than that. So again, some of that might just be variability one night to the next. Others might be a factor of, again, how close was the witness? How good was the witness's eyesight? As a parapsychologist, of course, you're quite familiar with all these variable factors that go into eyewitness reports and their content.
Well, one of the fascinating features are healings that seem to be associated with the visitations. And in particular, you focus on the very first sighting by a Muslim transportation worker who was across the street, who noticed it originally and experienced a remarkable healing.
Yes, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Right, yeah, the healings are definitely an additional notable feature of these events. So the very first recorded healing that we're familiar with, and we know about these healings from a couple of sources, by the way. So the Coptic Orthodox Patriarchate pretty early on appointed a medical commission headed up by a number of Egyptian physicians associated with the Coptic Church to investigate claims of miraculous healings and report back to the Coptic Pope about what people were claiming. And so the first claimed healing was, from one of these initial eyewitnesses, Farouk Muhammad Atwa, who was a public transit worker at the station across the street, who was himself a Muslim. And so he was the one who was initially seeing this glowing female figure, pointing at this figure and saying, basically just, don't jump, right? Again, he thought initially this might be a nun getting ready to end her own life. And, he reported that, so he, on that night, April 2nd, he had an appointment with his physician to have his finger amputated because he had an infection which had turned gangrenous. And so, but I believe it was the next day, or maybe it might have been later that week. I'd have to go back and look up the details. But when he went to his physician, the physician took off the bandages that were around his finger. He found it was completely healed. And this is notable in part, as I mentioned in the book, of course, there's all kinds of controversies surrounding alleged miraculous healings in various contexts. And these things are always controversial. And there's, in many cases, with miraculous healing reports, there's often the question of, well, could this be psychosomatic? The mind can do amazing things in terms of power of suggestion, self-healing, and things like that. But medical science generally says there are limits on this, right? The placebo effects, psychosomatic healing can only do so much. So you get psychosomatic healings more often in certain contexts. So, for example, with autoimmune disorders or things like this, where there's a lot of mind-body interaction going on with certain medical conditions. It's worth noting that gangrene is not one of these, right? If someone's got a limb that's turned gangrenous, it's got to be amputated, right? This is not something which is normally thought of as potentially subject to the placebo effect or to any kind of mind power improvement. And so that's a notable feature, that initial healing. And so the medical commission, the church appointed, investigated a lot of these cases. Egyptian newspapers at the time published a lot of healing accounts. So there was one newspaper in particular, the Coptic newspaper Watani in Egypt, alone recorded more than 700 miraculous healings, and what they believed to be miraculous healings anyway, that they recorded in their newspaper over the course of the 3 years of these events.
If I recall correctly, that newspaper probably published hundreds of articles about these apparitions during the 3-year period with many eyewitness testimonies.
They did, yeah. There was more than 2,000 eyewitness testimonies. This one newspaper alone included in their pages, because this particular newspaper was associated with the Coptic community, so they had a particular interest in these events. And there's a scholar, Sandrine Kariakos, who's written on the history of these events, who very painstakingly and with admirable diligence, went through these newspaper accounts and just counted up how many individual eyewitness reports does this newspaper provide, how many of these reports involve healings, and really did the rest of the scholarly community a service with that particular line of inquiry, which, I myself, I can't read Arabic, and so there's certain lines of inquiry involving some of these initial sources that I could not dig into, and I really had to rely on another diligent French and English scholars to provide that kind of information. So, yeah, and as you mentioned, these events were heavily covered in the Egyptian media at the time, in the wider Arab world at the time. There was some reporting in the wider global media. So the New York Times did a story on them. Reuters Wire Service did some stories on these events at the time. But when you consider the sheer numbers involved and the uniqueness of these events, in my opinion, they didn't get the amount of attention they kind of warranted from the wider global media at the time.
Well, the feature that has really stuck with me all these decades are the photographs. So let's talk about them. They seem to be crucial, but obviously photographic evidence can also be very controversial.
Yeah, and I do spend a little bit of time in the book talking about the photographs, with the exception of the cover art, which is actually a photograph of allegedly of the apparition. With the exception of the cover art in the book, I don't reproduce the photos within the book. In part, I was a little worried about copyright issues surrounding it. There's a bunch of these photos. I'm not sure what the copyright status of these things might be. But for your audience who might be interested in getting a better look at some of these photographs, there's a book written by a woman named Pearl Zaki about these events. Zaki, Pearl Zaki, the second edition of which came out in 2002. And she includes a very complete selection of photos of the events that were published at the time in Egyptian newspapers. So if you're looking for an accessible source to get a look at these photographs, that's a good one. And her book is reasonably easy to find and reasonably inexpensive. Yeah, regarding the photographs, so some of these were taken by Egyptian journalists, some of them were taken just by private citizens and relayed to the newspapers. There's a number of interesting things about the photos. So some of them are, as with the eyewitness reports, some of them are more detailed than others. Some of them are really just look like blobs of light. Some of them are much more human shaped, where you can definitely discern more detail in the image. So there's a variety in what the photos are showing. Likewise, some of the photos show these dove-type lights, these lights in the sky that were sort of vaguely bird shapes that people were reporting. Some of these photos. So there was a physicist, John Jackson. He and his wife and a Coptic deacon back in the 90s wrote a book on Zeitoun where Dr. Jackson gave a kind of, got an optics expert to look at some of these photographs and give a kind of assessment. And his view was that some of them were likely genuine, others he thought showed evidence of having been doctored, having been adjusted after the fact. So yeah, I don't know what exactly to think about all these photos. I strongly suspect that there are more photos of these events out there. My guess would be that if a really diligent researcher went into Egypt and, made some contacts in the Coptic community there and became trusted there, I suspect there's quite a few more photos in old family albums that have been sitting there for 50 years that nobody's had a chance to look at. So I think this could be an item likewise with some future original research if somebody had the resources to pursue that further.
Well, one of the things you suggest in your book is that given that there were at times hundreds of thousands of people out there, presumably some of them would have had cameras, you suggest there should have been more photos, and you hypothesize that people would point their cameras at the apparition, but when they developed the film, nothing showed up.
Yes. So there is a researcher, I believe this was... I think this was Francois Brune who came across this data point in some of his interviews where people were claiming that they had taken photos at the time. Then upon development, nothing showed up, which is interesting, right? And of course, you get this sometimes in the wider world of paranormal phenomena where you might have a UFO sighting or alleged haunting or poltergeist or something where there's some photographs taken of orbs of light or other alleged supernatural phenomena, and then later on it turns out that nothing shows up in the photo. So this is not unheard of in the wider world of kind of the paranormal, and obviously there's lots of speculation about why this might be. I don't really have a good explanation of what might be going on here. I mean, so if some of the photos are genuine, of course, that's evidence that we're dealing here with some kind of at least semi-corporeal reality, or some kind of reality that's taking on corporeal form in order to be able to show up on this instrumentation. And yet, if you've also got situations where the instrumentation shows nothing, that might be evidence that you're not dealing with anything that is any kind of normal physical entity. Similar complications, of course, arise in contexts in which. Let me preface this by saying I think there are many occasions on which, based on the eyewitness reports, we have good reason to think that everyone in the crowd was seeing basically the same thing, taking into account, again, prosaic factors like some were closer than others, some had better vantage points. You're dealing with crowds sometimes of tens of thousands of people you're trying to maneuver through. So there's all kinds of things that might account for some level of variability in what people were seeing. But we also have some evidence to indicate, I think, that there were also occasions on which some people in the crowd were, even when they were at a similar vantage point to others in the crowd, were seeing more than others. And it's not clear why that would be. But again, this is a feature of wider paranormal phenomena. Sometimes in the context of, again, just to give an analogy, since you'll know about this data from your own work, in haunting contexts, for example, you might get two people in an allegedly haunted house, or say three people in an allegedly haunted house, and two people will claim to see this, wispy amorphous figure floating through the room, and the third person won't see anything, but they'll feel a presence. Yeah. They'll feel the presence of some entity there, right? So you get this variability, even though they're in a restricted space, right? You'd think if there was something objectively real appearing there, they'd all be seeing exactly the same thing. And yet in some contexts, there appears to be a variability in what people are able to access. And this is kind of just an interesting issue for larger religious and research into religious and paranormal events generally. Why is there sometimes this variability which does not seem to be easily accounted for by prosaic perceptual factors? I don't have a great answer for this. I mean, there's an interesting, so I do record in the book a speculation by a Coptic priest and theologian that one of these researchers interviewed. He was actually the brother of the Coptic Pope. And his take on this, because he was asked about this specifically, his take was that he had a theological interpretation for this, as you might expect from a representative of the church. His belief was that the early days of the events, the first whatever year or so of the events, God was really trying to get the attention of the Egyptian people. And so he made sure that these events were sort of clearly visible to everyone. But then as the events continued and interest began to wane and maybe devotion began to sort of peter out a little bit, God might have sort of adjusted the situation and appeared more clearly to the faithful who were there for good motives, and maybe less clearly to people who were there just out of some kind of base curiosity or something. So he suggests that as the events progressed, more of this variability in perceptual acuity started to become apparent. And so, anyway, that's an interesting theological explanation for this. I don't know how much credibility to give that, but it's this is a larger issue for paranormal research that I don't think anybody has a really solid handle on, and maybe a theological explanation is as good as any other.
Well, let's go into some of the conventional, non-paranormal physical explanations that have been offered. It's interesting you focus in particular on one that was proposed by Michael Persinger, a well-known Canadian researcher, along with John Dare, who was an old friend of mine, worked with the U.S. Geological Service.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so Persinger and Dare, they co-authored in 1989, I think it was, a peer-reviewed academic article in the journal Perceptual and Motor Skills, a psychology journal, in which what they did was apply what's known as tectonic strain theory to the Zeitoun event specifically. So some of your viewers might be familiar with this theory, others maybe not. So maybe I'll just run through a couple of the details quickly so that your audience has a sense of what this theory involved. So basically, a tectonic strain theory is kind of a combination of like a geological theory and a neuroscientific theory, which Professor Persinger kind of developed with the intention of providing a sort of grand unified theory of paranormal and religious experiences. So essentially, Persinger's idea was that objectively real, odd light phenomena can be provoked in the atmosphere by geological activity, especially sort of heavy tectonic strain activity underneath the Earth. This is he kind of took the idea of earthquake lights and developed this a little bit further beyond what most geologists would recognize. But his idea was that geological activity can give rise to certain kinds of objectively real anomalous light phenomena in the atmosphere. And of course, this became part of his account of what might be going on in many UFO sightings, right? That they might be able to correlate UFO flaps with earthquake activity, for example. Anyway, so you have one aspect of this theory then is this geological component where it suggests that tectonic strain might prompt the occurrence of light orbs in the atmosphere. But the same shifts in ambient electromagnetic activity might also affect people's cognitive apparatus, right? So Persinger had this idea known as temporal lobe lability, where he suggested that some of us have, so the temporal lobe is a portion of the brain, and Persinger had the idea that some people had temporal lobes which were particularly vulnerable to shifts in electromagnetic radiation. And so as those shifts in either the degree or the wavelengths of this electromagnetic activity in the environment shifts, he suggested this might then affect the temporal lobe and prompt hallucinations in a certain percentage of the population who, again, have this physiological vulnerability. So with those two components of the theory in mind, what Persinger suggested was that a great many paranormal and religious experiences could be accounted for by these twin factors, and in particular, group paranormal events could be accounted for by these twin factors, right? Because you might get a group of whatever, a dozen, 50, 100 people who all see objectively real strange lights in the sky that are being prompted by this geological anomaly. But then a certain proportion of those people, because of the shifts in ambient electromagnetic activity prompted by the very same tectonic strain, will also have private hallucinations at the same time. So they're seeing these strange lights in the sky as a result of this tectonic strain. As a result of that same tectonic strain and its effect on the ambient electromagnetic activity, some of these people are having hallucinations. And depending on the individual's cultural or religious background, the content of those hallucinations are liable to differ. So, for example, when it came to, just to use the Persinger's work on the UFO phenomenon as an analog here, Persinger suggested that the tectonic strain theory could account not merely for like group sightings of strange lights in the sky, but could also account for close encounters of the third kind, right? Because you'd get someone who would witness these strange lights in the sky that were really there, because again they're being prompted by this geological activity. But then if they have this temporal lobe vulnerability, when they see these strange lights in the sky, they're then going to have a hallucination. And if they're a modern Westerner with our knowledge of pop culture and everything, and they've just seen these strange lights in the sky, and then they have a hallucination, well, what are they likely to hallucinate? Well, maybe that light in the sky becomes a ship that lands, and you got these little figures that come out and talk to you. And so Persinger thought that these twin components of tectonic strain theory could account for a great many paranormal and religious phenomena. And he took that general theory and applied it to Zeitoun. So what Persinger and Dare argued in that academic article was that Egypt in the 1960s was experiencing unusual levels of tectonic activity, which they thought they could establish through looking at the geological data collected by the Egyptian government. And then that geological increased activity combined, they hypothesized, were causing these strange lights that were actually there. This is why they could be photographed. But then combine that with the cultural background within Egypt, where, Coptic Christians, of course, have a devotion to the Virgin Mary, and Muslims as well, especially Muslims in 1960s Egypt, also had a kind of veneration of the Virgin Mary. And so Persinger and Dare hypothesized that when the crowds were seeing these strange lights in the Egyptian sky, their private hallucinations sort of took on the form of the Virgin Mary, and that's what was really going on.
And I think it's probably fair to say that among the skeptical community, this explanation has been accepted. Most people who are of that bent, naturalists, I think is a term you often use for them in your book, would assume, oh yes, the Persinger-Dare hypothesis is clearly the best explanation we have.
Yeah. So, for example, Joe Nickell, who is pretty well known in sort of the skeptical community, he was a prominent member of Psychop. In one of his books, his explanation of Zeitoun is precisely this. He latches on to Persinger's account and believes that that sort of does the trick with these particular events. Yeah, and some additional authors have gone the same route in subsequent years.
But you've analyzed this theory in some detail and have pointed out that there are severe weaknesses in the suggestion. For one, as I recall, it doesn't explain why the apparitions are associated only with this particular church.
Yeah, that's right. So even if we assume for the sake of argument that tectonic strain theory in general is a potentially workable account of paranormal phenomena, I don't think it does a very good job of accounting for the specifics of Zeitoun, in part for the reason you just noted, that, if you've got this unusually high level of geological strain going on, even if we grant that this might cause anomalous lights in the sky, you would expect them to be taking place all over Egypt, right? You would not expect them to be localized to the roof of a single church in a single neighborhood. That doesn't really compute. So I think that's one definite weakness. I think likewise, tectonic strain theory does not do a good job. I mean, it fits in well with some of the later variability of what people were seeing, but I don't think it accounts very well for the much greater degree of consistency you find in the eyewitness accounts, especially from the first year and a half of the apparitions, where we have eyewitness reports from multiple people of events of the same night, and sometimes those line up even in terms of close detail. And that doesn't fit very well with the notion that, well, these people were just having private hallucinations that were being structured by their own individual cultures. That might explain why multiple people were seeing the Virgin Mary rather than a space alien, but not why the Virgin Mary was appearing in this particular shape, walking in this direction, blessing the crowd in just this way. Why she appeared in the particular... So one other thing to note is that, so on some nights the figure would simply appear, full figure, spontaneously. On other nights people would see this, what they would describe as a line of light. Almost like you see, if you've got a closed door with a lit room on the other side, how you see that line of light at the bottom of the door. What they would describe is they would see this line of light, and the line of light would grow and expand into this female figure. You'd have multiple people reporting this on a given night. Now, again, shared cultural background might account for why they're seeing the Virgin Mary rather than some other supernatural figure, but there's nothing in Christian or Muslim devotional material or background cultural expectations that would lead a group of people to share that detail. And so I think that's difficult to fit into the specifics of tectonic strain theory. Even if tectonic strain theory were workable, which I try to argue that It actually isn't, as a generic theory of the paranormal.
Well, you go into some detail as well in your book, and it may seem like a tangent, but I'd like to discuss it with you, and that's the development of what came to be known as the God helmet that Persinger created in his laboratory, basically something like a football helmet that had various electronic devices inside, so it would stimulate the brain with a weak electromagnetic field, and the idea being that people who wore this helmet would then report religious visions.
Yeah. So as an extension of tectonic strain theory, or a way of further developing and defending it, Persinger had the idea of providing experimental support for the theory. And so he set up a lab at his university in Ontario where, they developed this helmet, where what the helmet would do, and as you say, it's kind of a football helmet with some solenoids attached to it. And what the helmet was supposed to do was flood the cranium with specific wavelengths of basically electromagnetic radiation. And of course, at a safe level and everything, but, a level which Persinger hypothesized would be sufficient to prompt hallucinations in those with temporal lobe, this vulnerability of the temporal lobe. And so he found that indeed, when he performed these experiments, he performed hundreds and hundreds of these trials on undergrads at, it was Laurentian University in Ontario. And he found that, a certain percentage of them would report afterwards, having, especially a sense of presence would often be reported, or sometimes even visual sensations that they felt to be unusual, or very strong emotions. And so Persinger took that as being experimental support for tectonic strain theory. But what later researchers found, and by the way, I should note that the God helmet and this aspect of Persinger's theory achieved a great deal of public attention, sort of the late 90s, early 2000s. So this got out in the mainstream media. So it was like CNN and TV Ontario did news segments on the God helmet, and Wired magazine did an extended story on Persinger and the God helmet. So it got a lot of attention. And I think one of the reasons why later researchers then attempted to replicate this is precisely the fact that it did get attention beyond the academy. Anyway, so one difficulty that's emerged from in the last sort of 15, 20 years is that as other neuroscientists tried to replicate Persinger's results, they found that they couldn't. And so the consensus seems to be emerging now that the reason why a certain percentage of Persinger's students were having unusual experiences while wearing the God helmet probably had more to do with suggestion than with the electromagnetic waves. And so, for example, some of these later replication studies, what they would do is they would give one group of research subjects the actual God helmet in accordance with all of Persinger's own experimental parameters, right, with just the quantities and wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that he would specify. Then another group would have all the same experimental parameters in place, except they'd be wearing a sham helmet, right, just a regular, helmet with some solenoids that wouldn't transmit anything. And what they found was that there was no difference in levels of people's reporting of unusual encounters. And so that was one I think interesting bit of countervailing data that's emerged in the intervening years. And so what a number of neuroscientists who followed up on Persinger's work have come to theorize is that what was happening was probably more just a combination of, look, if you put people in a sensory deprivation chamber for a half hour, a certain percentage of them will have odd experiences. Doesn't matter what the larger parameters are. Likewise, if you prime them with the suggestion that what you're testing for is potential paranormal experiences, of course you're going to get a larger percentage of people having weird experiences. And the people undergoing these original experiments at Laurentian University were well aware this is what Persinger was testing for. He was famous for this. Right, and so this degree of suggestion was also thought to be a factor, perhaps, in explaining why he was getting the kind of results that others were unable to replicate.
Well, another more conventional explanation for Marian apparitions, not just at Zeitoun, but elsewhere, is the idea of mass hallucination. And that's another argument you tackle.
Yeah, I've got a brief chapter on that, and I wish I'd had time to add a little bit of additional material there, but I kind of ran out of time with sort of, as you know, when you get to the typesetting stage of a book, you got certain deadlines in place. But I would like to point out that Harvard psychologist Tim Lomas has been doing some work recently on sort of the paranormal in general. And in one of his papers, he points out quite rightly that within psychology, the notion of mass hallucination is really not well substantiated, right? This is not a well understood, testable phenomena, right? That the notion that there is such a phenomena of where you might get a large group of people who appear to be seeing the same thing that's just totally not there. That just does not seem to be something that modern psychology has been able to substantiate as something that happens. It's hypothesized to account for certain sorts of odd group experiences, but it's really just tacking a label onto something we don't understand very well. But I also point out in the book that there's lots of reasons to think that these events were not a matter of mass hysteria or what we might term mass hallucination, and there's a number of reasons to think that. One is the fact that, again, the variability of these events. So again, the appearance of these seemingly supernatural occurrences occurred. This was intermittent and unpredictable. So in a given week, you might have 100,000 people camped out in front of the church on Monday and Tuesday, and nobody sees anything, despite the fact that they're all psychologically primed, they hope to see something, they're emotionally charged, etc., and nothing happens. And then on Wednesday, you got a dramatic event that lasts for half an hour and then stops. Well, if it's mass hysteria or mass hallucination, why don't you get people seeing bizarre things on each of the 3 nights? I mean, the composition of the crowd is largely consistent. Or even on the 3rd night where they do see something, why then don't they just get a continual hallucination that might last for hours? Why does the figure appear for maybe 10 minutes and then disappear again? That doesn't seem to fit with something like mass delusion or some kind of mass psychosis. That's not how certainly this would be an unusual feature of an individual psychosis. And likewise, on a mass scale, I don't think that really fits the data. Likewise, the fact that you would get the same people coming back on multiple nights, and on some nights they'd be really disappointed, and on other nights they'd see amazing things. So, is the same person under the same group dynamics on these different nights? Why are they hallucinating on one night and not another? It just doesn't seem to fit what was actually going on empirically on these evenings. Likewise, you sometimes had skeptical witnesses who were there, not really expecting to see anything, and yet they see something remarkable. So I think all of those militate to some degree against the mass hallucination hypothesis. Of course, the photographs, if any of the photographs are genuine, that tells against mass hallucination because it would indicate that there's some kind of objective odd light phenomena which is present. One other thing just to note. So again, just by way of emphasizing the uniqueness of Zeitoun, it is very common in religious history. It is very common that you will get some prophet or visionary or someone who will publicly, and maybe they're running a religious movement or a cult or something. They'll announce to their followers, they'll announce to the larger community that, hey, there's going to be a miracle taking place. Go to this spot at this time, and you'll see God work a great miracle, or you'll see the UFO land and do a great wonder or something, whatever it might be. And so there's so many situations in religious history where you get tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people assembling on a hill on a given time and place, waiting to see some remarkable event, where people are emotionally primed and there's a high level of expectation. And nothing happens and everybody goes home disappointed and maybe the movement falls apart. This happens again and again in religious history. And again, if someone believes in, if someone wants to use mass hallucination or mass hysteria as a general explanation for some of these rare events like Zeitoun of a group religious experience, again, why is it happening on some of these occasions and not others? Like what separates out these crowds in Egypt that they were seeing things? Whereas the vast majority of time in comparable contexts, nobody sees anything. Everybody goes home disappointed. So again, I think by way that also underscores again the uniqueness of these events in the context of modern religious history. There's not a lot of, other than maybe the so-called miracle of the sun at Fatima. There's not even in the realm of Marian apparitions. There's not a lot of close parallels.
Well, another obvious explanation that has been brought up would be that this is some form of a hoax, that somebody is motivated to create an illusion using, who knows, some type of technology.
Yeah. So I have a chapter on the hoax explanation, and this was a bit of a tricky chapter to write because although that the possibility of a hoax has been floated for a long, long time, and even was discussed at the time, is there possible that someone is faking this? Nevertheless, no scholar has come up with an actual model of how this might have been hoaxed. So I didn't really have anything concrete to work with by way of trying to assess this suggestion. But what I do is I look at what the obvious candidates one might put forward for some kind of technological method. So, you might think, well, is it possible someone was simply projecting an image, right? Like some kind of, something like the bat signal, but shaped like the Virgin Mary, just projecting that onto the church. And I think that's clearly ruled out by the fact that a projection, people would have had an easier time finding the source of the projection, for one thing. At night it would have been relatively easy to suss out where this is getting projected from. Moreover, a projection would be a 2D image, and from the eyewitness reports, it's very clear that people describe this as a three-dimensional lifelike figure, at least much of the time. Again, there's some variability on different occasions, but much of the time this is described very specifically as a vivid three-dimensional figure, and so it doesn't really fit the phenomenological data. Moreover, the Egyptian government early on, in trying to figure out what was going on, So, for example, during the early days of the apparition, the local government cut power to the whole neighborhood to see if this might affect what was going on, right? Because if somebody was using some kind of image projection, they would have needed a power source. And that had no effect on what people were seeing. Like the image, the figure appeared regardless. So anyway, I think 2D projection is not likely. One obvious suggestion is, well, what about a hologram, right? Because holograms appear to be three-dimensional. Well, again, we're talking 1960s Egypt. Holographic technology was very new at the time. It would not have been available in Egypt at the time. Moreover, holograms are always stationary. Like even today, we don't have the technology to create a 3D moving hologram. So again, it doesn't fit with what people were seeing, even if somehow the technology had been available to whatever the Coptic Church at the time, which seems unlikely. So I think that there's no really good candidates technologically for what might have been used to do the hoaxing at the time. Moreover, even if we accept for the sake of argument that there might have been some sort of workable technology that could have accomplished this, I don't think there's any plausible culprit. Right? If you look at who might have had the motive, means, or opportunity to do this, the obvious potential candidates are the Coptic Church or the Egyptian government. And so sometimes people have floated the idea, well, maybe maybe the Egyptian government did this to gin up tourist dollars, right, and bring people in on pilgrimages to the church or something like this. But I don't think that makes any sense. But one of the reasons I think it makes little sense is that, imagine a government in the Arab world in the 1960s deciding to gin up tourist dollars by faking a religious apparition. Well, if you're living in a 90% Muslim country, in a region which is more than 90% Muslim, surely the kind of apparition you would want to fake would be something like a vision of the angel Gabriel atop a mosque, right? You're not going to fake an apparition of the Virgin Mary atop a Christian church. That's not going to boost your tourist dollars as much as it would if you were to go for the dominant religious community. So I don't think the Egyptian government is a good candidate. I don't think the Coptic Church is a good candidate. I mean, that would have just been enormously risky. The Coptic Church was already at a kind of a dangerous time in 1968 for a number of reasons that I lay out in the book. I think this would have been far too risky for them. And again, they just didn't have the technological means to go back to that point.
One of the arguments you seem to make is that if this phenomenon doesn't have a naturalistic explanation, then we should look for a supernatural explanation, one presumably having to do with the Christian Church and the Virgin Mary and so on. I wonder about a third category there, paranormal. You've referenced paranormal explanations a few times. Have you looked into that?
Yeah, good point. So in the book, so the thesis of the book is really quite narrow. What I'm arguing is that at the moment, there are no convincing naturalistic explanations for what happened in Zeitoun. And so at the moment, I think these events provide some positive evidence for for the notion that there's more to reality than just the physical. So I've got a very narrowly defined thesis, which I try to keep sort of pretty modest in the book, right? That this is just, it's evidence against naturalism. It's not a knockdown argument against naturalism. I mean, it's conceivable it's conceivable that at some time in the future, someone will find a better naturalistic explanation. Maybe someone will, maybe conceivably someone will uncover some kind of secret technology that governments were testing at the time. And Zeitoun was some kind of bizarre test case for some sort of ultra-sophisticated holographic technology. There's no good evidence for that now. Maybe it'll emerge in subsequent decades that's conceivable. My argument is just that at the moment, all of the naturalistic explanations that have been put forward are not very convincing, and so at the moment we've got some evidence that there was something non-natural going on here. Now, of course, what do we mean by non-natural? Well, we might mean something theological, right? We might, of course, go with the explanation that the Coptic community themselves have adopted, which is this actually was the Virgin Mary. Or we might just go with a more generic non-naturalist account, right? That there was something paranormal or non-physical going on here. What it might be, we don't know, and that also would fit fine within my thesis. Now, so within the book, I don't really speculate much further between those two potential options. But of course, it's interesting, which might be the better way to go. So, I have my own personal views on this, which I'm sure you can guess. But certainly, alternative, non-naturalist but non-theological explanations are very much worth looking at, and I don't want to be dismissive of those. I don't get into them in the book, but that's not because I don't take them seriously. It's not because I don't think they're worth talking about. It's just that those explanations, again, fit within my own hypothesis, so I don't feel the need to try to work against them in the context of the project. But yeah, we might, for example, think about, so D. Scott Rogo talks about Zeitoun in one of his books in 1979, 1980, somewhere around then. And his general theory of the paranormal, as you know, was a kind of internal generation theory, if I understand him correctly, whereby the human mind has the power to prompt the emergence of objectively real psychic entities that can exist independently of the human mind itself. Something like, some of your viewers might be familiar with the idea of like a tulpa in the Tibetan tradition, or like an egregore into Western esotericism, right? Rogo's idea is something vaguely along those lines, right? The human mind can generate images which might extend beyond the boundaries of the brain. And so Rogo suggests that a bunch of different paranormal phenomena might be accounted for in this way. And if I've understood him correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think he also had a kind of collective aspect to this, right? That this can happen at the individual level, but conceivably it might also happen at the collective level, right? You've got a group of people who share a similar belief system, who are intently focused on a certain mental construct that they might even without realizing it, they might inadvertently collectively create a kind of psychic entity, which then might have a kind of objective existence, but one that is still rooted in the human mind. So I believe that is Rogo's preferred explanation for Zeitoun and related events. Michael Grosso, I think, has a similar.
Mm-hmm.
He has a larger metaphysical account of like a world soul theory as well that he integrates this with. But I think that's also an aspect of his account. So yeah, I think there's a number of paranormal researchers that work you would know better than me that would have theories that I think would be potentially applicable to this. And again, I think are worth talking about.
I'm glad you brought up Michael Grosso and D. Scott Rogo. Rogo was a distant cousin of mine, actually. So, yeah, I knew him well. He died tragically, unfortunately. Michael Grosso is still alive and active. You also point out that there have been both Freudian and Jungian efforts to interpret the apparitions as according to psychological dynamics.
Yeah. So I've got a chapter on the work of a Canadian sociologist, Michael Carroll, who wrote a book on Marian apparitions years ago, proposing basically a Freudian psychoanalytic account for both the origins of Marian devotion, but also for Marian apparitions. Now, his main focus in that book is on private Marian apparitions and the psychodynamics behind them, but he also has some material on group Marian apparitions. And so he talks about a few case studies, including Zeitoun. Of course, that's largely dependent on taking seriously a lot of Freudian theory, which I'm happy to do. My dad was a Freudian psychoanalyst. I'm not as dismissive of some of Freud's work as a lot of people are today. But I don't think he does a great job of using that theory to explain what's happening in group Marian apparitions in particular. So, in fact, what Carroll ends up doing, a lot of the work in his account of this ends up being done by, basically what he says is, well, there must have been some objective anomalous light phenomena that people were misinterpreting perceptually as the Virgin Mary as a result of cultural background and certain psychodynamics that were going on in the crowd. But he never provides any sort of explanation of what that anomalous light phenomenon might have been. He sort of just hand waves, well, some sort of meteorological anomaly. Well, fair enough, but that's not a lot of meat to dig into there with that hypothesis, right? Again, why was this anomalous light phenomena geographically restricted to the roof of a church? So I don't think Carroll's theory, even if you find his broader account of Marian apparitions in terms of Freudian analysis, even if you find that interesting, I don't think his application to Zeitoun ends up doing a lot of work. Much more interesting, I think, is a recent book by, and I apologize in advance if I'm going to mess up the pronunciation of her name, but Valeria Cespedes Musso, Musso. I'd encourage your viewers to have a look at her book. So this came out several years ago. So she has a book on a Jungian analysis of the Zeitoun events, and she does a nice job of providing an overview of the apparition events and giving a look at some eyewitness accounts. And then, but most of her book is spent providing an explanation of these events from a distinctively Jungian point of view, which and I don't want to, there's a lot of details in her work that are interesting, and I don't want to risk sort of oversimplifying them, but essentially what she does is she takes Jung's theory of UFOs. So as some of your viewers might know, Jung's final book was on the UFO phenomenon, and what he was trying to do was provide a kind of account of the UFO phenomenon, including group UFO sightings, by reference to his model of the collective unconscious and the ways in which stressors can prompt items found in the collective unconscious, can bring that up to the conscious mind in the form of hallucinations of various sorts, both at the individual and the collective level. And so what Musso does is basically take that Jungian model of UFO sightings and apply it to Zeitoun. So she explains Jung's model of the collective unconscious, how it's employed in accounts of visionary experiences, how the collective unconscious might produce visions both on an individual and a collective level. And then she applies that and sort of assesses what was going on in Egypt at the time, the sorts of psychological stresses that people might have been under that might have been prompting this kind of thing, and then uses that to provide a model for what was going on in Zeitoun.
So that sounds like something that might be plausible.
Conceivably, yeah. I mean, it depends on how plausible we find the whole Jungian system, which of course is very complex and lots of things one might discuss and debate about the specifics of Jung's model. My narrow concerns in the book, I tend not to focus that on that so much, but more just on well, first off, I point out that even if one grants for the sake of argument that Jung's model of the collective unconscious is basically correct, I don't think Jung's model of the UFO phenomenon is very convincing. And by extension, since that's pretty crucial for Musso's account, by extension, I think that ends up being a problem for her model of Zeitoun. So just to give one example, and some of your viewers will be very familiar with the arguments on this sort of thing back and forth when it comes to Jung's theory of UFOs. But one obvious criticism of Jung's account of the UFO phenomenon was his suggestion was that the stressors of the Cold War were putting sort of strain on the collective unconscious. And so part of Jung's theory of the collective unconscious is that the collective unconscious is the container for all kinds of archetypes. And these archetypes are associated with various kinds of symbols. And so one of the archetypes found in our collective unconscious is the archetype of the self, right? Selfhood is one of these. Archetypes are kind of like Platonic forms, only they're purely internal, right? So we have this archetype of the self, and Jung thought that the symbol associated with the archetype is kind of like a sphere. And so Jung's idea with the UFO phenomenon was that as society as a whole came to fear universal annihilation, right, all selfhood being wiped out through nuclear war in the early 1950s, this put massive strain on our unconscious minds, and so the collective unconscious as a way of dealing with this collective stress. Of course, when these archetypes transition into the conscious mind, the symbols associated with them transition into the conscious mind and give rise to visions and hallucinations. And of course, because people are worried about the destruction of the self, Jung thought that the kind of visions this particular stress would give rise to were visions of spheres, right, flying saucers. Okay, with all that in mind, one obvious worry that arises regarding Jung's account of the UFO phenomenon is you would sort of expect then that when the Cold War ended, people would stop seeing flying saucers. Or at least that flying saucer sightings, the UFO phenomenon would basically grind to a halt when widespread fear of nuclear annihilation would stopped, basically, or it was massively diminished in the 1990s, early 2000s. But of course, that's not what happens, right? The UFO phenomenon kicks into high gear in the 1990s. So there's just empirical data, I think, to show that there's reason to think that Jung's hypothesis about UFOs is just empirically falsified. So that's one worry. Another worry, that just to bring it back to Zeitoun more specifically, if what's going on is the collective unconscious giving rise to mass visions associated with certain symbols, and Musso has a complicated explanation as to why what people were seeing was a female figure, and the Virgin Mary specifically. She relates this back to certain archetypes and certain symbols. But again, if that was going on, you would expect these sorts of visions to be happening all across Egypt, not localized to the roof of a single church. And so one problem with her Jungian account of the Zeitoun events is basically the same kind of problem we find with Persinger's tectonic strain theory. It doesn't account for the narrow localization of the events.
So at the end of the day, we're left with a mystery.
Yeah, we're at least left with a mystery. And of course, my brothers and sisters in the Coptic Orthodox Church will want to encourage us to reflect further on that mystery and consider possible theological ramifications of all this. And I think that's totally legitimate as well. And I hope Coptic theologians will produce some more English language scholarly work on these events that we can reflect on. I'm really not the ideal person to be doing that kind of theological work. I'm not a theologian. I don't belong to the Coptic Church, but I hope that work will be done in the near future. I think that'd be valuable.
Well, Travis Dumsday, this has been a very informative, fascinating discussion. I want to thank you for taking the time to put the book together and taking the time to be with me and the New Thinking Aloud audience.
Yeah, well, again, it's a privilege to meet you, Dr. Mishlove, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a PDF copy or order a beautiful printed copy of Issue 6 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine.